I forgot to mention previously that WordPress will output 0 if you don't kill the script. If I were to open the wp-admin/admin-ajax.php file and scroll down to the bottom, there will be this conditional statement that checks if the user is logged in. If the user is logged in, it'll use the normal AJAX function. Otherwise, it'll perform the non-privileged AJAX function. The very last line here kills the script with the output 0. So keep in mind that you're more than safe to kill the script in your function, and most of the time you'll want to do so. We'll be working inside the AJAX function throughout most of this lecture. I'm going to include the global WPDB object so we can insert the rating into the database. Next, I'm going to process the post array and create two separate variables named post ID and rating, which will be set to the corresponding post values. I'm going to process the ID through the function absint, which will return an absolute integer. The rating will be processed through the round function. This function will round the rating. Set the precision to 1 since we don't want anything deeper than a tenth of a value. We'll also need the user's IP. There are a lot of ways we can do this, and it's up to the developer to decide how to get the IP. WordPress does not provide any functions for getting the IP. For this lecture, I'm going to grab the IP from the remote ADDR key of PHP's server variable. It's not the best way because there are other keys in this array that contain IP addresses, but it'll do for our purposes. The last variable I want to create is one for the response. This will be an array with a key of status and its value will be 1. You'll see what this value is for in a moment. This step is optional, but I want to show you how to handle responses. The next step is to insert the data into the database. Let's take a look at the WPDB's documentation. This object has a method called insert. Let's take a look at that. As you can see, WordPress provides all the information on how to use this method along with an example. Let's use this method now. I'm going to call this function right after our variables. The first parameter of this method is the name of the table we want to insert data into. Just like last time, we'll be using the prefix property to get the prefix of the current WordPress installation. The name of the table is recipe ratings. The second parameter is an array with the keys as the column names and the value as the value to insert. Our table has 3 columns we should set: the recipe ID, rating, and user IP. Your array should look something like mine. The third parameter is optional, but you should always use it for security purposes. The third parameter allows you to filter each value by data type. For example, the ID will always be an integer. We don't want a string or a boolean. We want an integer. Pass in an array. You will have to pass in a certain format. There are 3 formats we can use: string, integer, and float. The format for string is %s. The format for integer is %d. The format for float is %f. Float, by the way, is just a fancy word for numbers with decimal values. We'll be using all 3 of these for our query. Since the first value we insert is an integer, we're going to use %d for that value. The second value should be %f, and the third value should be %s. We're almost done. After the insert, I want to update the status key of the output variable to 2. 1 will be if the insert was a failure. 2 will mean it was a success. I want to send this variable back as the response. WordPress provides a function specifically for this task. Call the wp-sendJSON function and pass it in the output variable. This function will JSON encode the array and then kill the script. You can think of it as a sugar function. This is perfect for AJAX requests. It'll also take the time to send the response as a JSON type so jQuery knows to process the body and let you use the data as an object. Try rating the recipe now. If you check the developer tools, then you should see the response be an object with the status property set as 2. You should also check the table in the database to make sure the data was inserted correctly. If you refresh the page and try rating the recipe again, you'll find another insert. We don't want this. Let's delete that second insert. Let's fix this by checking if the user already rated the recipe. For this, we'll be using a custom SQL query rather than a method. We could have inserted our data without the insert method, but the insert method provides extra security and sanitation. Create a variable called rating count, and the value will be set to the value returned by the getVar method of a WPDB object. The documentation tells us that this method will return a single value from a SQL query. The SQL query we're about to make will count the number of rows from the recipe ratings table. Here is the query. Select count star from WPDB prefix recipe ratings where recipe ID equals post ID and user IP equals user IP. We also need to specify the recipe ID and the IP of the user so we don't get any generic results. If we do end up finding some rows, this variable will be set to the amount of rows found. Next, I'm just going to check if row count is greater than 0. If it is, I'm going to call the wp-sendJSON function and pass in the output variable again. Let's try rating the recipe again. You should see the response object with the status of 1. Check your database as well to make sure no rows were inserted. To recap what's going on, when the user clicks on the rating for the first time, the function will check if the user has rated this recipe before. If they haven't, it will insert the rating. If the user is able to rate the recipe a second time, then the function will make the same check, and if there already is a rating, it'll end immediately. There are two possible results, which is the status being 1 or 2. Looks like we're finished with processing the results. The next thing we'll need to do is check for the rating on a page, refresh, and average out all the ratings. The post metadata needs to be updated as well. Before you get started, empty the recipe rating table. We're going to start fresh. Let's get started with averaging the rating first. Inside the rrate recipe function, I'm going to add the code right after the database insert. Let's grab the metadata first by calling the getPostMeta function. There are two properties we want to update. The first property is the rating count. This will contain the number of ratings this recipe has had so far. All we need to do is increment this with the double plus sign. Next, we need to average the rating. We can use the getVar method for this. Let's use the same query we used last time. This time, we don't need to check for the IP. Instead of count, change this to AVG. This is a MySQL function that will calculate the average of a specific column. The column we want to average out is rating. This query will return the average. I'm going to wrap this query with the round function and set its precision to 1. I don't want a long decimal number. That's basically it. All we have to do now is update this post metadata using the update post meta function like so. I'm going to add some comments so that it's easier to read our code. The next step is to display the average rating to the user and prevent them from rating again if they already rated the recipe. Inside the template, add the attribute data-rateIt-value and set its value to a string placeholder. I'm also going to add a placeholder for the read-only property. Open the filter function file and replace the rating placeholder with the actual rating. For the read-only property, we're going to borrow the code from the rating function, specifically the rating count variables. We need to add the WPDB global variable so that we can use the getVar method. We also need to replace the ID in the query with the post object and access the ID property. Now we can simply use a conditional statement and act accordingly. If the user already rated the recipe, then we'll change the read-only placeholder to the data-rated-read-only attribute and set it to true. Otherwise, we'll just replace the placeholder with an empty string. The read-only property is set to false by default, so we don't need to set it ourselves. Rate your recipe to 5 stars. Refresh the page and you should see your rating still there. You also shouldn't be able to rate this recipe again. I'm going to do something you usually shouldn't do. I'm going to go back to the ratings table and I'm going to change the IP of our rating to a random number. I want to test out the average out. I will now be able to rate the recipe again. This time, I'm going to rate it a 3. I'll refresh the page one last time and we should have an average rating of 4. We're finished. Congrats! At this point, we're done with the rating system and the single post. I'm going to give you a challenge. Try and figure out a way so that our plugin allows for users to change their rating for a recipe and update the rating accordingly. You will also need to update the average as well. You have the knowledge to handle this challenge. Good luck!